Hey everyone. We are going to get started. I'm Hannah Brakke. I am the Director of Product here at LabKey. And today I'm going to be talking to you about breaking free from spreadsheets and really working towards streamlining your sample tracking in the lab. I have a lot of experience in this, both working at LabKey as a product manager, listening to clients and hearing sort of the struggles that they have within the lab, as well as my previous life. I worked in a lab for about 10 years. I both did malaria vaccine research as well as worked in a translational lab working on CAR T-cell immunotherapy clinical trials in kids. So have a lot of experience on both using spreadsheets and also trying to get out of spreadsheets. And then as I moved into my role at LabKey, I also was an account manager for many years, really helping people move out of spreadsheets and get into more robust systems to help with their laboratory management. So as I'm going through the presentation today, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A in the Zoom window in your screen. We'll try and get to as many of them as we can kind of at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to just sort of add those through and we'll try and address them. So the reason why we're here really is sort of the use of spreadsheets. And I think none of this is going to be so much of a surprise for any of us here, that there are a variety of sort of pitfalls when it comes to using spreadsheets, especially with things like sample tracking. Data integrity is kind of a primary one. So when you can have a lot of human errors and things like creating typos, or I think we've all done this where we've been filtering a spreadsheet pretty extensively and then realize that we forgot a column and now everything's kind of jumbled together. Having copy and paste errors or other issues as you're sort of manipulating that spreadsheet. The other issue sort of around data integrity and spreadsheets is that lack of data validation or standardization. So oftentimes we'll see a field with multiple values that kind of mean the same thing, but unless you're either an expert in that space or able to identify, it's hard to access that data in a usable way, kind of from an analysis perspective. The auditability of spreadsheets is quite poor. We all know that there's sort of no traceability in a spreadsheet as you are adding, removing, updating records, trying to figure out who did what really on a sample when. And then it's also very poor help in troubleshooting. So even in labs that don't have a necessary regulatory component, audit trails can often be very useful when we're working and trying to understand why our data might be erroneous or something's going wrong. And so that auditability or traceability of what's happened to a sample can help us understand why our experiments aren't going to plan as well. And then scalability. This is another one that folks often come to us with, where they've got spreadsheets that they can't open anymore, or they're so slow, they're actually becoming very unusable in the lab, and it's making folks very inefficient. Or they're just spread out among dozens of files that it's really hard to actually find anything or utilize that data in any practical way. So as we're thinking about sort of streamlining sample management, coming back to those core tenets of sample management, and to me, I put this into ChatGPT. I was very curious of like, what would the internet say? And they had sort of 11 or 12 different answers for this, but I think it really boils down to these three things. And these kind of stem from the FAIR principles as well, if you're familiar with those. But really, these are the three things that we see folks wanting to do with sample management and struggling to do, especially within spreadsheets. So identification of a sample is really important, right? You're collecting these samples, you spend often a lot of time or money or resources trying to acquire these samples and get them and process them into your lab, making sure that they have unique identifiers or that sample accessioning value to understand what sample is what from one another, and then also clear sample labeling, right? So I've certainly worked in labs where we are writing with sort of an ethanol-free pen on our tubes and putting those in the freezer. That can be useful for a short amount of time, generally not a very long-lasting approach for being able to uniquely identify samples. The traceability of samples is also important. So understanding that chain of custody, how that sample kind of got to where it's at, as well as understanding that sample context, or what we like to call the metadata about the sample. Things like where it was sourced from, or maybe the date that it was sourced, or additional information that helps you identify that sample to be useful for future experiments or reports. And then findability of a sample is also really important. So you can go through all of the work of identifying it and making sure that it's traceable, but if you can't actually locate it physically in your lab, that becomes very problematic as well for sort of your research. So making sure that you can find the sample both physically, but then also finding that sample kind of as you're looking for samples with certain attributes can be very helpful as you're thinking about kind of sample management needs. Generally, it's probably going to be, again, sort of no surprise to anybody here. The pitfalls of spreadsheets really are not well supported for these core tenets of sample management. So again, kind of why we're here is to talk about ways to get out of this. And again, I've done this in a variety of different ways and in a variety of different lifetimes now, it feels like, at this point with folks. So I'm going to be sharing some tips on this today with you, but generally it can kind of go into 5 major steps. You want to be able to evaluate your sample management needs and see kind of where you're at with spreadsheets. Going ahead and researching solutions that are actually going to be sort of useful for you, and sort of the right size of a solution as well is going to be important. Making a decision and choosing the right vendor is sort of that third step. And then you actually have to sort of do the work or hire someone to do the work to get your data into that system. So organizing your data, cleaning that data and getting it in. And then that final step, which really is just sort of an ongoing step, is ensuring sort of that appropriate adoption of a new system with folks in the lab. We know that people like to use things that they're comfortable with. Excel is so ubiquitous and spreadsheets are so ubiquitous and essentially free for most of us at organizations, that it tends to be a really sort of reliable, comfortable fallback when folks don't have the right training or are frustrated with a current system. So we see this a lot and want to try and sort of help you through each of these steps. So the first thing in your evaluation is really take stock in your lab. Talk to the folks that are in your lab and that you're working with. Talk to them about what spreadsheets they're using. Try and understand kind of what those processes look like. As you're doing this, always kind of have in the back of your mind, potential growth or expansion of your lab or research or projects, because the other thing you don't want to do is create a system that works for now and not for later. And so trying to really set yourself up for that future growth or expansion is going to be helpful. Compiling all of the different spreadsheets, and this is really just sort of understanding what you have and taking a look at each of those. Once you have those in hand, you can then start to really suss out how those spreadsheets are used, which will help you be able to identify what type of solution you might be sort of after or looking for. So as we're thinking about how spreadsheets are used, I've got a little poll here for you guys, if you could sort of fill this out, how you're using spreadsheets now. I would say most often it's going to be all four of these things, but we'll see kind of what you guys say as well. But I've sort of broken this down into four main components, especially thinking about kind of that sample management or sample tracking components, where it can be sort of a way to manage your samples or inventory. So things like sample accessioning, I've got tons of folks that are like, we have Excel that's doing this sort of unique identification or accessioning for us. The sample tracking and trying to track quantities potentially, or amounts of reagents or inventories within the lab. Sometimes we see freezer management where we've got sort of maps of freezers within things like Excel or Google Sheets to track where things are in storage. And then oftentimes there'll be other spreadsheets that will capture that metadata, that sort of source information or date-based information. So those are kind of the main components of sample management. There's also like the lab process management piece of it, which really is around sort of the work that's being performed in the lab. And so sometimes folks will have sample processing happening within spreadsheets where it's sort of indicating we had this blood sample that then got isolated for PBMCs, which then got further isolated for DNA or something like that. So being able to sort of track that within a spreadsheet. Very, very common to manage sample requests through spreadsheets, right? It's really easy to send a spreadsheet to a collaborator. You know they're going to be able to open it and fill it out and respond. And also tracking shipment of samples within spreadsheets. So this could be sort of the shipping in and out, or sort of creation of those shipping manifests to go with the samples in the box as well. The experimental data component, of course, raw data files from instruments, right? So this is something we may not have a lot of control over in the end, but certainly we're getting sort of that experimental data through instrument files. Using Excel for analyses or aggregation of data is very, very common. And then sometimes we see Excel or spreadsheets being used for experimental design or data capture around experiments too. And then lastly, reporting, which it can be sort of all sorts of different types of things, from internal reporting like capacity planning, or more external reporting around sort of regulatory agencies, funding, submissions for INDs, things like that. And it looks like you guys have answered. Thanks so much for doing that. There's a fair mix, right? And so I'm not surprised to kind of see that we've got sort of this mix in. A lot of you are saying sort of sampler inventory management or experiment data management is happening. So I think this it's really great to sort of see you here, and hopefully I can help you today. So after you've identified how these spreadsheets are being used, I really suggest sort of creating a plan, right? It's really easy to feel overwhelmed with all of the different things, especially, most of us are saying we're using spreadsheets for all four of those things. So trying to identify pain points and sort of write those down, again, kind of engage your team, make sure that you guys are getting that idea sharing. But trying to identify, as a primary pain point around the sample identification piece or traceability, or potentially sort of that findability. Is it that you can't find samples? Is it taking days for folks to find samples within the freezers? Or are we getting mixed up when we're looking at tubes because they're not uniquely identified or improperly labeled, things like that. Experimental reproducibility or sort of general experiment management, right? Are you struggling with that reproducibility piece that you want to make sure gets kind of tightened up and understanding how those samples are being processed sort of prior to the experiment. Or are there other pain points, right? Every lab is going to be unique in what they're sort of struggling with. So having a list of those and identifying those is going to be kind of the first piece of this plan. And then going in and prioritizing, right? So you won't be able to boil the ocean. That's not a very sustainable choice to do this, especially in the lab. This is not anybody's sort of primary job to move out of spreadsheets. So being able to prioritize things, I most commonly see folks prioritizing based on like highest risk. So maybe you've got an audit coming up, or you want to move towards your lab being CLIA certified. Those are reasons to start thinking about how you can move out of spreadsheets and into a more robust system, or things that are the most time consuming. So those folks that are spending several hours in the freezer looking for samples, perhaps that's kind of your greatest need at this point. You want to free up some of that time so they can get back to the actual science. Or sometimes it's easiest to prioritize those things that are easiest to tackle, right? If it's something like freezer management, you might be able to tackle that much more simply than something like the reporting piece of it, or something like that. And then the final piece of your plan here is really to determine your goals, right? So do you want to fix these pain points for specific projects? Is it more around lab-wide tracking that you're interested in? Is it going to be for a certain sort of collaboration effort that you're undergoing? Do you want to just have all of your freezers organized? Things like that will help you identify kind of what system is going to be really best suited for you at the moment. And so now you're kind of ready for researching solutions. And how software can help has been sort of my bread and butter for a long time. Even when I was in the laboratory, I was sort of managing laboratory management systems, and always looking for ways that we can help sort of support science through technology, because that's kind of where we are here in 2023. So as you're researching solutions, there's going to be sort of 4 main different types of products that you might come across. And so I just want to get sort of familiarized with those. That freezer management product is going to be super useful in keeping your freezer organized. So if that's sort of that primary pain point for you, you're really struggling with that findability piece, you don't know where things are, that's going to really help support that. Sometimes freezer management alone solutions can be limited in functionality. So you may sort of be lacking that ability to tackle the metadata or have that full sort of sample traceability here. Sample and inventory management systems will do a little bit better job of that. They're really going to help support sort of that overall sample lifecycle management, trying to understand what's happened to a sample. They tend to sort of lack automation in these cases. So if you are on a more advanced journey towards trying to automate things, maybe integrate with some robotics that you have within the lab, this may not be sort of a sufficient enough solution. And those are really, these sample and inventory management tools are really going to help support sort of that identification piece, accessioning, label printing, things like that, as well as that traceability. What's happened to the sample to get to where it's at? ELNs, or electronic notebooks, will certainly help you sort of capture those experiments that are performed on samples. So really supporting that sample traceability again, what's happened to this sample, who did what, when, with what reagent almost. And these are really, really great tools for sort of capturing that. Usually have some sort of searchability to it as well, but they can be siloed. So you might end up with an ELN that you really, really like, but then you're sort of lacking that freezer management piece and not having those things integrated. And then lastly, I think this one is probably maybe the most familiar for most of us, but sort of a full-blown LIMS or laboratory information management system. These generally are very holistic solutions. They'll almost always have some components of the top 3 here. But they really can feel quite heavy-handed or too much for some labs, especially labs coming from spreadsheets going into this. Usually we see folks kind of spending weeks or months sort of trying to implement this, sometimes even beyond that. Like I've even heard a few stories of years implementing. So it might be certainly something to consider for the future, but it may not be sort of the direct need at the moment. And really those LIMS are going to support all 3, sort of that sample identification, traceability, and findability piece for sure. So more importantly to the actual sort of product that you're looking for, what you want to be focused on are features that are going to support your pain points and really help support you in the lab. So if you're struggling with that identification piece, what I'd recommend is looking for terms or features around automatic sample accessioning. And there's sort of 2 rules of thought of this. Is there's a really it's really great to create some long computer generated numeric value that can like easily be fed into a barcode. But that's not going to help you when you're looking at those tubes and doing your research. And so you also really want to consider human-friendly sample IDs or labels around your tube. So that automatic sample accessioning, being able to print labels from the solution as well is going to help you with that sample identification, and making sure that you can register samples in bulk. So one of the other things you don't want to do is go through and have to register 100 samples uniquely at a time, and that's really going to slow you down and make you less efficient and sort of incline people to move back into Excel or spreadsheets. So making sure that they have bulk registration options that are going to work for your lab. If you're struggling with things like sample tracking, looking for features or tools around chain of custody tracking, making sure you know who has done what on the sample and how, again, it's gotten to the place that it's gotten. Ensuring that they have sort of robust audit logging, making sure that there is the ability to add metadata around your samples. So not only do you know what happened to that sample, but you know all of the information you need to be able to utilize that sample for your research. I'm going to add here that we want sort of flexible and customizable metadata, because the last thing you really want is a product manager like me deciding what fields should be important to you. You want to be able to sort of pull in and use the data that you care about rather than something the product has stated it is important. Looking for tools around sort of sample lineage or sample tracking can be very useful in understanding sort of that context of where a sample has come from. And then looking for tools around sample processing or shipping can be very helpful in sort of helping support your work and track that those processes within the system. And then lastly, if it's sort of the findability piece, the freezer management component, so being able to map your freezers to a digital space, making sure that there's sort of robust search tools that you can find your samples easily, either through sort of the human readable sample ID or even through the barcode, but also looking for like querying or reporting capabilities that's going to help you find the samples that have certain metadata or attributes about them is going to be important here. So for this webinar, we're really not going to talk about sort of that decision piece and like how you might decide on a software. I think that's for another webinar, but I'm going to assume, you've gotten to this point and you've made a decision. And so, congratulations that you've chosen something. It's time to start getting your data ready. And if you are still deciding, and if this is sort of all brand new, and you're interested in learning about sort of that decision process and what you might want to look out for as you're choosing vendors, we are going to send a guide and an email sort of following up to this around choosing the right software for your sample management needs. My colleague Lance Ludwig, who's a product specialist here, will be reaching out and can really help you decide if you're still in that process. So once you're kind of there and you're ready to do your migration or start using the system, there are kind of three things that we want to consider. Firstly, you want to understand what the accepted formats of the vendor are, and so talking with your vendor and seeing sort of what that format is that you need your data in to get it migrated is going to be important. Checking with the vendor for resources that they have. So oftentimes vendors will offer sort of onboarding or implementation resources or training resources, sometimes free, sometimes paid. So definitely look out for that. And then also understand any timelines that you're working for. So we have some clients that come to us with a tight timeline because they're trying to get out of a different system, or they're trying to start a new project and trying to get ready for that project. So being able to understand what those timelines are going to be important as you're getting started. A few decisions to make as well. So are you going to do a migration and move that data kind of from your spreadsheets into the new system, or what we call kind of in the tech industry, more of a cut over, where you leave that old data sort of where it is as archived, and then anything from a given date is sort of moved into a new system. The migrations can also be sort of rolling or complete. So maybe you're migrating one freezer at a time, kind of at your schedule, or doing a complete migration of everything within the system. So that's kind of the starting point for you. Typically, the decision here is driven by the type of data, I will say, and also the urgency or sort of the activity of the project. So if you have an active project, it might be very useful to migrate that over rather than a cutover. But if you've got sort of a freezer full of archived samples, you might be able to say, hey, we're going to leave these in Excel for now and really focus on sort of the work that people are doing in the lab at the moment. And then I like to do a little rendition on like when you're moving, if you're gonna keep it or toss it or donate it. In data terms, what you want to look at is what data in these spreadsheets do you want to keep? What is really valuable in serving you? What data might you want to modify? So maybe it's not removing it, but sort of modifying it in a way where that makes sense to you, making it like a more structured drop down, or modifying how you're capturing a piece of data. Or is it something that you can toss? So this happens a lot in other systems where there's fields that don't matter to you, or if you have a field that might be inaccurate or sort of loosely captured, you may not be interested in sort of moving that over as well. So having a good understanding of what data is that you do want to migrate is going to be important. And then really act, right? So there's sort of that consolidation process, which you probably have already done if you've gotten kind of to this point. But then there's really going to be a data cleaning piece of it as well. And so overall, before we get into sort of these tips, what I'm going to say is there's probably someone like me in your lab that loves a spreadsheet and loves some data. And so I would really sort of reach out to folks if this is the piece of it that you're dreading and you're just like trying to like walk through mud in, perhaps there's some other resources for you. So I was always this person for folks in my lab. I really loved the organization piece of it and the data piece of it. So I was always happy to get data normalized or standardized to specific standards that we were striving for. So that's kind of my first tip is like find someone like me that loves this stuff and really gets joy out of it. And then also making sure that that person has enough capacity and time to do that, of course. But if you are this person, or if you don't find this person and you're still stuck with it, here are a couple of tips that I'd sort of recommend in general that's going to work sort of almost for any system. So overall, you want to avoid special formatting. So the thing that we love to do within Excel is format it and make it pretty and put it in this like very human readable, human understandable way. That is often directly at odds with what these systems need for migration. So really taking the time to try and remove some of that special formatting, merged data cells, things like that, and formatting your spreadsheets in this really standardized single tab tabular formation is going to set you up for a lot of success in sort of a migration effort. So I've given kind of an example here of what that might look like. You also can sort of take an eye and like simplify where possible. So if you've got a ton of fields that are basically the same, or you have like a notes field and a comments field, like perhaps those things can be combined. Also simplifying sort of visually, removing the coloring, or again, sort of that special formatting is going to be useful. Removing non-alphanumeric characters is also generally best database practices. There's going to be lots of systems that support these, so you may not have to be as strict with this one, but certainly trying to identify places that this might be fairly easy. My most common one I think we see is sort of the percent sign, where it's pretty easy to just change that to percent and capture the data that way. Making note of data entry discrepancies. So this is another really common one in spreadsheets where because the data is not validated, you're getting sort of multiple entries for what might mean the same thing. This is not something that you necessarily have to address, and sometimes the solution that you find will actually support you better in helping address those and standardize those. It's just good to kind of make a mental note of it. So as you're going through that migration effort, you're prepared to answer those questions or sort of identify that and move on to the next thing to do. And then lastly, I know we've talked a lot of stuff about spreadsheets so far, but there are some really, really helpful tools for data cleaning. Particularly, I'll say sort of Excel's data tab is almost my #1 favorite thing to use when I'm trying to clean data in a non-programmatic way. So exploring what some of that functionality looks like can really help you get the data in a format that your vendor is looking for. And then sort of assuming you've gotten there, assuming you've done sort of all of that prep work and made the decision and migrated your data in, the last thing, and this is really, again, sort of that ongoing piece of it, is avoiding the spreadsheet backslide. So making sure that your lab staff are trained with the new system, that they're comfortable with it, that maybe you've even appointed some super users or experts to really get to know the system to help answer questions, will make them feel empowered to use the system, as well as really gain that adoption within the lab. Finding ways to also provide value. So when we think about something like freezer management, if it takes you 5 minutes to find the samples you need rather than 4 hours, that's going to provide value for folks that are actually working in the lab. So ensuring that whatever you choose is sort of benefiting them is going to help them adopt the system as well. Honestly, being a little bit strict and adhering to new processes and ensuring that people are doing this, I think is also going to be really beneficial in gaining that adoption. What I like to do, especially with very resistant folks, is put it on a timeline and say, let's try this in earnest for 2 or 3 months. And we're going to circle back and talk about it afterwards. And if you hate it, if this isn't working, if it's slowing you down, if it's not providing the value that you need, we can reassess and consider something else. Which really leads into sort of that fourth option of being receptive to feedback. So making sure that the system is adaptable, but also the folks involved are adaptable as well to try and really make this work for them. And then lastly, really utilizing what resources your vendor provides. So again, oftentimes vendors will provide onboarding or training, ongoing support. Some of these are free, some of these are paid, so definitely look out for that. But typically, your vendor is going to know the software better than anybody else. And so ask them and really rely on them to help support you in this effort. And so lastly, I work at LabKey. So how can LabKey help you? We have a lot of experience of working with scientific data in our organization. So we have specialized in this for 20 years now. We are experts in sort of data management and being able to support you. We've seen so many different scientific use cases and needs arise through our years of experience. And so we have sort of that experience to be able to help you with this. Again, there's kind of tons of people like me who love this stuff. We love getting into it and like really helping see you succeed. So we're able to support you in that. We also have built-to-purpose tools for the sample and laboratory data management. The product that I manage, Sample Manager, has freezer management, sample and lineage tracking, the ELN, the workflow management, the chain of custody and audit log. I love this product. I think our clients do too, and I hope you check it out for sure. We also have unparalleled support. And I know this is probably something a lot of folks say, but we really do. And it's something that I experienced when I was actually a client of LabKey's prior to coming over. But it's also in how we conduct our business. Our client success are our success. And so we want to make sure that we can help the software help you and not sort of you fitting to what the software has to do. And then lastly, our migration, implementation, onboarding, training, ongoing support is all included. So this is something to sort of consider as you're looking at other vendors as well. So in general, we talked about sort of the sample manager piece. I hope today you got to see kind of what that life cycle might look like. We may not be able to fully break out of spreadsheets altogether, right? There's still going to be those instrument generated files that we're sort of stuck with, but I think there's a lot of great tools out there that can really help you be supported in a much more sort of robust and sustainable way. And so with that, I think I'll pause and take a look at any questions. So feel free to sort of add them in the Q&A or the chat. I'll see if I can find them here in my messaging. So yeah, I think one of the questions that was asked is sort of what are the biggest challenges that I see for clients coming in, and I think there's kind of phases of it, right? Where the first initial challenge is folks are really afraid of change and how to sort of manage that change and be supported through this and feel like they're going to be successful. And so that's something, again, we at LabKey really like to share our experience with and help you guys because that change management is a real piece of it. I've experienced it. I've lived it. I've been on the other side where I'm like totally resisting and don't want to do it. And so having kind of just that human experience where we can talk about what folks are struggling with, what are they worried about? And also really considering like how much of this can Sample Manager or LabKey take off your plate for you to get back to the science and for us to do sort of that migration piece or change management piece is a big component of that. I see another question here around how LabKey is storing the data with sample management. So We are a cloud-based solution. Sample Manager is a cloud-based solution. We do have on-premise options for our SDMS product, and so we kind of can do both, but primarily we are cloud-based, and it's a relational database kind of on the back end if we're getting really technical with it, which allows us to do a lot of really cool things within the application. So every time I sort of add a piece of data about a sample, we're sort of linking those things together and being able to identify and piece together what has happened to that sample. Yeah, I see another question kind of around sort of the ELN. And we actually do have an ELN as part of Sample Manager as well that is fully integrated within the system. And what that means is that you can actually make live direct links to sample data or source information or assay data. So you're not sort of repeating or falling into those traps of like human error, essentially, during your notebooking. And another sort of question here around sort of imaging systems. So we do actually have clients that maybe not aren't developing imaging systems, but certainly working with high-res imaging, scans, things like that. And there are tools where we can, in our larger sort of SDMS products, actually integrate with those. But we also have more simplistic sort of integrations or links where you can create sort of links out to data as well. So I think there's definitely some solutions here that we'd be happy to discuss further. And yeah, what does that onboarding or implementation time look like? So for I would say generally for sample management solutions, you're going to get kind of a varied window of probably days to months. I've certainly heard some clients that have spent longer. Sample management is going to be a lot more of a short timeline than like a LIMS timeline for implementation. Here at LabKey with our Sample Manager product, we actually track this. So we're able to sort of tell you in earnest, and typically our implementations take about 6 to 8 weeks. Usually it's dependent on sort of the complexity of data and where it's coming from. But generally we're talking about sort of days to weeks and not weeks to months, which is super awesome to kind of get you guys in systems quicker. And yes, columns in LabKey can be customized. So we're always sort of making sure that that whatever fields you want to capture are fields that you want to capture, right? So you're able to fully customize an unlimited number of user-defined fields within the system that sort of are relevant to your data. And yes, we also have an audit trail feature. We are Part 11, CFR Part 11 compliant. We also support sort of HIPAA compliance. We have folks working in GXP or GMP environments as well. And then additionally, we also offer a software validation that comes from our third-party vendor that they sort of validate the software. And we work together with them to get that done. Okay. Yes, and if it's early in the morning for you, I am a big fan of coffee. So yes, I hope everybody's got a cup in front of them. Okay. Well, thank you guys so much. This was kind of a topic near and dear to my heart. So happy to share it with you. And please reach out or please look out for the emails from Lance, and I'd be excited to chat more for sure.